Hollywood's golden era gave us unforgettable stars whose images were carefully crafted by studio systems. But behind the glamorous facades, some of these legendary performers were notoriously lacking in common sense, intelligence, or basic awareness. Their own colleagues, family members, and industry insiders documented these shortcomings through interviews, biographies, and studio records. Let's explore the surprising truth about these celebrated figures. Milton Berle's stubborn downfall. During the early days of television, Milton Berle commanded unprecedented attention, earning himself the moniker of Mr. Television. His variety program dominated ratings, capturing more than 4/5 of viewers nationwide. However, his astronomical success bred an arrogance that ultimately undermined his career. Berle developed a reputation for brazenly appropriating material from fellow comedians. His writing team regularly complained about his recycling of antiquated jokes from decades-old vaudeville performances. When network executives attempted to refresh his format, he adamantly resisted change, insisting his original formula was responsible for his fame, even as audience numbers declined. Behind the scenes, his conduct was erratic and counterproductive. According to Gerald Nachman's biography, Berle demanded script approval while refusing to actually read the material and dismissed writers impulsively. His instincts frequently proved misguided. He rejected numerous innovative programming concepts and refused to share screen time, paranoid that other performers might eclipse him. His business ventures were equally misguided. He declined a profitable film opportunity with MGM because he was unwilling to reduce his nightclub schedule, missing a chance to expand into cinema. In the early 1960s, he opened a chain of comedy venues bearing his name but never visited any location, and they all shuttered within 2 years. Despite pioneering television comedy, Berle became obsolete. He never understood that sustained success required continuous learning, flexibility, and occasionally yielding the spotlight. He remained frozen in time. Rod Steiger's self-sabotage through method. Rod Steiger garnered widespread critical praise for his powerful, intense portrayals in major productions, including On the Waterfront and In the Heat of the Night, earning him an Academy Award. Yet his extreme commitment to method acting techniques, coupled with emotional instability and questionable career decisions, transformed him into a warning tale throughout the industry. Steiger's immersive technique frequently alienated his fellow actors. During production of Dr. Zhivago, director David Lean reportedly battled with Steiger over his refusal to approach scenes fresh. Steiger demanded time to achieve a specific psychological condition before filming, sometimes halting production for extended periods. Omar Sharif characterized collaborating with him as emotionally draining. His pursuit of perfection often morphed into self-destruction. He rejected the lead in Patton, which subsequently earned George C. Scott an Oscar, because he felt the screenplay lacked emotional depth. He also passed on The Godfather, dismissing it as overly commercial. Though he later expressed regret about both choices, he continued spurning mainstream opportunities in favor of smaller, less coherent projects, offering creative autonomy. In media appearances, Steiger routinely blamed the entertainment business for failing to appreciate him. Yet colleagues remembered his unpredictable temperament and unwillingness to find middle ground. Director Sidney Lumet observed that Rod possessed brilliance but unnecessarily complicated situations for everyone. During his final years, Steiger battled depression and financial difficulties, accepting roles in low-budget international productions and television programs simply to survive. He believed he was misunderstood, but never recognized how his inflexible principles and sense of superiority isolated him from opportunities. His abilities were tremendous, but they became his prison. Jane Mansfield's fatal miscalculation. Jane Mansfield possessed remarkable intelligence, reportedly scoring 163 on IQ tests, speaking 5 languages fluently, and playing classical violin. However, she constructed her entire public identity around portraying the unintelligent blonde stereotype, committing to this character so thoroughly that even studio executives believed it reflected reality. The real tragedy wasn't her lack of intellect, but how she weaponized perceived stupidity to advance a career that eventually collapsed beneath her. From her emergence in the 1950s, Mansfield saturated tabloids with outrageous publicity stunts, deliberate wardrobe mishaps, champagne-filled swimming pools, and interviews loaded with provocative quips. Her manufactured public image overshadowed any potential for legitimate dramatic work. When cast in notable productions, critics dismissed her performances as caricatures. According to biographer Martha Saxton, Mansfield frequently undermined her own prospects for lasting success. She once rejected a prestigious theater opportunity because it lacked television visibility. On the production of Hollywood's first mainstream film featuring nudity, she prioritized shock value over substantive character development. Her private life descended into chaotic decision-making. Her marriage to bodybuilder Mickey Hargitay dissolved into acrimonious legal proceedings. She associated herself with controversial figures and surrounded herself with dubious publicity schemes. At her career peak, she appeared in a series of cheaply produced European films with nonsensical scripts and minimal direction. Mansfield's accidental death in 1967 cemented her public image not as an intelligent woman constrained by industry limitations, but as a cautionary example of a performer who embraced the dumb blonde persona so completely she couldn't abandon it when it began destroying her career. Peter Lorre's Prison of Insecurity. Peter Lorre possessed one of cinema's most recognizable appearances with his bulging eyes, gentle voice, and unsettling screen presence that made him memorable in productions like M and The Maltese Falcon. Yet, the distinctive qualities that differentiated him also confined him to a limited range in Hollywood. Despite his intelligence and keen wit, Lorre made surprisingly restrictive choices, driven more by self-doubt than professional ambition. Lorre arrived in Hollywood during the 1930s after escaping Nazi Germany. Fluent in multiple languages and classically trained in theater, he nevertheless accepted any available work. Terrified of unemployment in his adopted country, he rapidly became typecast as villains, lunatics, or foreign oddities. When presented with mainstream opportunities, he frequently declined them, convinced audiences wouldn't accept him beyond sinister roles. He openly resented the industry, yet refused to challenge its limitations. Director John Huston once presented him with a dramatic part that could have redefined his career, but Lorre declined, explaining he didn't want to confuse audiences. According to biographer Donald Spoto, Lorre's greatest obstacle wasn't Hollywood, but his own self-doubt. He also made bewildering personal choices. Addicted to morphine throughout the 1940s, Lorre depleted his finances on narcotics and questionable medical treatments. He rarely negotiated his contracts, permitting studios to compensate him far below his co-stars. At one juncture, he borrowed money from Boris Karloff to prevent eviction from his apartment. Lorre wasn't unintelligent. His intellect was widely recognized by colleagues, but he was deeply uncertain of his value, and allowed that fear to trap him in identical roles, identical narratives, and ultimately, quiet obscurity. Peter Lorre possessed a philosopher's mind and a ghost's heart, drifting through a system he never dared challenge. George Raft's legendary poor judgment. George Raft possessed the appearance, voice, and streetwise confidence that defined 1930s gangster cinema. He was Humphrey Bogart before Bogart achieved stardom. But where Bogart ascended, Raft repeatedly, almost absurdly, undermined himself. Not from lack of opportunities, but from making catastrophic career choices. Born in Hell's Kitchen, Raft's authentic connections to organized crime helped secure his earliest parts. He could dance, fight convincingly, and wear a fedora as though born wearing one. However, according to multiple biographical accounts, including Louis Yablonsky's work, Raft showed minimal interest in screenplays and rarely read them completely. He selected parts based on how tough the character appeared, once rejecting a significant role because the character seemed weak. He infamously turned down the Maltese Falcon, the part that made Bogart a star. He rejected Casablanca, dismissing it as an odd little war story. When offered Double Indemnity, he passed, uncomfortable with the moral complexity. Studio leadership grew frustrated. A 1942 Warner Brothers internal memo described Raft as consistently uncooperative and alarmingly short-sighted. Raft's personal relationships only reinforced the narrative of his imprudence. He maintained close friendships with gangsters like Bugsy Siegel and Frank Costello, regularly gambling away his earnings at illegal casinos. When questioned about his decisions, Raft shrugged, stating he stayed with what he knew. His career faded as rapidly as it had risen, overtaken by the very actors who accepted the roles he dismissed. By the 1960s, he was making brief appearances in second-tier films, his early promise long eclipsed by his stubborn refusal to think beyond surface appearances. George Raft wasn't forgotten because of his accomplishments, but because of everything he chose to reject. Johnny Weissmuller's spectacular decline. Before Hollywood discovered him, Johnny Weissmuller was a record-shattering Olympic swimmer with 5 gold medals and 1 bronze. In 1932, MGM gave him a loincloth and cast him as Tarzan, transforming his primitive yell into box office success. However, once cameras stopped rolling, Weissmuller's intelligence, or absence thereof, became an industry-running joke. According to studio documentation, Weissmuller frequently struggled with script comprehension and had difficulty memorizing dialogue. Director W.S. Van Dyke allegedly simplified scenes specifically for him, emphasizing action over conversation. He was notorious for improvising incomprehensible grunts when he forgot lines. One crew member quipped in a 1940 industry publication that they simply let him swing. He was better with the rope than with scripts. Despite earning substantial income, Weissmuller made catastrophic financial decisions. He invested in unsuccessful hotels and gimmicky enterprises, including a bizarre attempt to establish a chain of Tarzan-themed restaurants. By the 1960s, he was financially ruined. In interviews, friends characterized him as pleasant, but incredibly naive. His personal life reflected the same impulsive tendencies. Married 5 times, he once proposed to a woman he met at a club the previous evening. Even his final years were characterized by confusion. Living in a Las Vegas hotel, he reportedly wandered corridors in his bathrobe, still identifying himself as Tarzan. Fame granted him immortality, but also concealed a staggering lack of awareness. Ed Wood's delusional vision. No discussion of poor decisions in Hollywood would be complete without Edward Davis Wood, Jr., a filmmaker by passion and self-proclaimed genius. Wood possessed an imagination exceeding any studio budget, but absolutely no comprehension of how to execute it. His 1959 production, Plan 9 from Outer Space, is widely labeled the worst film ever created. He cast aging silent film star Bela Lugosi shortly before his death, then substituted him with a taller actor who concealed his face with a cape. The flying saucers were paper plates suspended on strings. Wood insisted it was sophisticated art. Colleagues recounted his inability to understand fundamental filmmaking techniques. He often filmed entire sequences without checking focus, and his screenplays were filled with grammatical mistakes and bewildering logic. Actor Paul Marco once stated, Wood believed every line he wrote was equivalent to Shakespeare. In Rudolph Gray's biography, Nightmare of Ecstasy, Wood is portrayed as endlessly optimistic and delusional. Convinced that his failures were ahead of their time, he never recognized his own deficiencies and frequently blamed critics for not understanding his vision. He died in 1978, impoverished and forgotten, subsisting on cheap whiskey and typewritten fantasies. Only decades later did cult recognition find him, too late to change the fact that Ed Wood wasn't merely a terrible filmmaker. He was a man utterly unaware that he lacked the tools for the empire he imagined he ruled. Wallace Beery's brutish limitations. Wallace Beery stood as one of MGM's most profitable stars during the 1930s, dominating the screen with his rough charm and imposing presence. He won an Academy Award for The Champ in 1931. Yet among industry insiders, he was whispered about not for his acting versatility, but for his intellectual limitations and violent temperament. Beery's behavior on set became notorious. Directors frequently complained about his inability to follow nuanced instruction. His screenplays were often rewritten to remove emotional depth or complicated phrasing. According to MGM records cited by E.J. Fleming, Beery would memorize lines phonetically, lacking genuine comprehension of the words. Joan Crawford despised working with him. She allegedly told a friend after enduring his bullying during Grand Hotel that he was cruel, stupid, and arrogant. Other actors, including Jackie Cooper, recalled being physically harmed by Beery's reckless improvisation during scenes. In one interview, Cooper revealed Beery would pinch him to induce tears on camera. Off-camera, Beery's decisions bordered on absurdity. He invested in ostrich farms and novelty candy shops, insisting they would become the next gold rush. When asked to speak on political topics at a studio event, he reportedly responded that he didn't have time for that kind of thinking. Even during his prime, executives considered him difficult and intellectually limited. Despite his success, few regarded him as more than a reliable brawler on screen, an actor who delivered box office returns but required careful handling, simplified scripts, and wide berth to avoid confrontation. Wallace Beery's legacy endures in film history not because of intellect or insight, but because brute force occasionally gets mistaken for charisma. Buster Crabbe's refusal to evolve. Clarence Linden, Buster Crabbe, was America's golden athlete in 1932, winning a gold medal in the 400-meter freestyle at the Summer Olympics. With his athletic physique and chiseled features, Hollywood soon came calling. He became a serial screen hero: Tarzan, Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers. However, behind the action hero facade was a man who never quite grasped the machinery of the industry that created him. Crabbe admitted in later interviews that he never read complete scripts. He focused on stunts, not character development. In Flash Gordon, his lines were often dubbed in post-production because he flubbed them during filming. Director Frederick Steffani had to design scenes with minimal dialogue to ensure continuity. Despite his repeated success in low-budget serials, Crabbe resisted branching into more challenging material. He declined dramatic scripts, believing audiences didn't want to see him as anything except an action hero. As film historian Richard Bann noted, Crabbe never evolved because he thought evolution wasn't necessary. His investments reflected similar logic. He once poured his earnings into a chain of backyard swimming pool franchises, only to be bankrupted by legal disputes and maintenance problems. When offered a television reboot of Flash Gordon in the 1950s, He demanded creative control, then lost interest midway through development, leaving producers scrambling. Crabbe's downfall wasn't scandalous or dramatic. It was marked by a quiet refusal to grow. He remained loyal to his image long after the public had moved on. He wasn't a fool in the classic sense, but in an industry that demanded adaptation, Buster Crabbe remained stuck in a loop of splashy entrances and wooden exits. Esther Williams's shallow stardom. Esther Williams carved out a glittering niche for herself as Hollywood's million-dollar mermaid. Her aquatic musicals during the 1940s and 1950s dazzled audiences with synchronized swimming, elaborate costumes, and high dives choreographed like ballet. However, beyond the glitter and water tanks, Williams possessed little understanding or concern for the mechanics of her stardom or the rapidly evolving film industry around her. Williams was athletic, charming, and photogenic, but she wasn't known for intellectual curiosity. In her own memoir, she admitted to rarely reading her scripts before arriving on set. She once joked that if it didn't involve a pool, she wasn't interested. Directors like Charles Walters often had to design scenes around her physical capabilities rather than any dramatic talent. Her personal life was equally haphazard. She married 4 times, including to Fernando Lamas, who famously insisted she abandon her career and defer to his authority. She agreed. When asked in a 1984 interview why she permitted it, she simply stated he was strong and she liked strong men. Friends remarked on her lack of business acumen, especially when she passed up television offers, believing the medium was beneath her even as her film roles evaporated. Williams also made poor entrepreneurial choices. Her swimwear line collapsed due to poor management and failed marketing strategy. By the late 1960s, she was financially insecure and struggling to re-enter the public eye. She didn't understand how to reinvent herself or connect with newer audiences. Her beauty and skills had brought her to the top, but once the MGM water tanks dried up, so did her relevance. Esther Williams was never accused of being unintelligent, but she was shockingly indifferent to anything that didn't sparkle on the surface. In an industry built on reinvention, she remained still and sank quietly from the spotlight. Frank Fay's toxic arrogance. Frank Fay was once considered among the greatest stage comedians in America. His timing, voice control, and command of live audiences during the 1920s earned him top billing in vaudeville and Broadway. However, behind the curtain, Fay was a toxic combination of arrogance, prejudice, and stunning social ignorance. He didn't just derail his own career. He alienated an entire industry that once revered him. Fay's success made him believe he was untouchable. During his early days at Warner Brothers, studio memos noted how difficult he was to direct. He ignored cues, rewrote scripts without permission, and mocked crew members openly. George Burns once called him the funniest man who ever lived and the most detestable human being he ever met. His behavior off-stage was even worse. He openly voiced anti-Semitic and racist views at a time when most of Hollywood, run by Jewish studio moguls, was beginning to distance itself from overt bigotry. During Prohibition, he made headlines for drunken rants in nightclubs and was arrested multiple times for disorderly conduct. His wife, actress Barbara Stanwyck, eventually divorced him, citing physical and emotional abuse. Fay turned down offers to appear in sound films after 1931, believing talkies were beneath him. When he finally accepted a role in God's Gift to Women, his performance was so wooden and disconnected that critics eviscerated it. Within a decade, he was unemployable in film or radio. Biographers like Nick Tosh's point to Fay as a tragic figure not because he lacked talent, but because he refused to see beyond his own reflection. By the 1950s, he was performing at second-rate clubs and sleeping in rented rooms, the industry having collectively shut its doors on him. Frank Fay's story isn't just one of ignorance, it's about the danger of mistaking applause for infallibility. William Frawley's volatile nature. William Frawley is best remembered for playing Fred Mertz on I Love Lucy, a role that etched him into pop culture history. However, behind the scenes, Frawley was a volatile, belligerent presence whose abrasive personality and lack of self-awareness often made him his own worst enemy. Before television rescued his career, Frawley had been a struggling character actor throughout the 1930s and 40s. He was known around studios for being difficult to direct, frequently slurring his lines due to chronic alcoholism. Directors, including Wesley Ruggles, reportedly refused to work with him after too many ruined takes. He once had a scene removed entirely from Miracle on 34th Street because he couldn't remain sober long enough to deliver it properly. His reputation nearly cost him the I Love Lucy role. Lucille Ball initially opposed his casting, citing his erratic behavior and drinking. Desi Arnaz eventually agreed to bring him on under strict conditions. Frawley had to remain sober on set and arrive punctually. Surprisingly, he did. But offset, his old habits resurfaced. He was known for starting bar fights and was banned from several Hollywood lounges for disruptive behavior. Frawley had little patience for modernizing his craft. He scoffed at acting classes and rehearsals, once telling a younger co-star that if you need to practice, you shouldn't be in this business. His arrogance and lack of adaptability closed many doors. When I Love Lucy ended, producers were hesitant to cast him in anything substantial, fearing he'd regress to old patterns. Though a talented comic performer, William Frawley often mistook bluntness for wisdom and defiance for strength. He coasted on a single great role, but never understood how close he came to losing it all, simply because he refused to evolve, listen, or take responsibility for himself. John Arthur's self-imposed isolation. John Arthur possessed one of the most distinct voices and on-screen personas of the 1930s and 40s. With her husky voice and expressive eyes, she shined in classics like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. Yet behind that charm was a woman who spent much of her career running from fame, from the press, and often from her own success. Arthur had a well-documented fear of public speaking and social interaction. More troubling was her inability or unwillingness to navigate the basic functions of the film industry. She refused press interviews, rejected public appearances, and rarely engaged with studio executives. According to Frank Capra, she would leave through back exits and sometimes vanish between projects, avoiding contact for months. Her anxiety bordered on professional sabotage. During filming for The More the Merrier, Arthur allegedly had breakdowns over lighting and costumes and insisted on filming without crew members watching. Director George Stevens had to rebuild entire sets to accommodate her discomfort. Despite winning an Oscar nomination, Arthur later dismissed the film as a miserable experience. She also declined major roles that could have sustained her stardom. She turned down His Girl Friday, It's a Wonderful Life, and even parts written specifically for her. When Columbia Pictures offered her a contract extension in 1944, she rejected it in favor of semi-retirement, retreating to her apartment with no clear plan. Arthur eventually returned to teach acting at Vassar College in the 1960s, but even then students reported that she was often evasive, cryptic, and emotionally distant. Her brilliance was real, but so was her detachment. Jean Arthur didn't fall from grace because she wasn't talented. She drifted away because she couldn't or wouldn't function within the world that made her a star. Earl Holliman's safe mediocrity. Earl Holliman entered Hollywood with the promise of a long and steady climb. He won a Golden Globe for The Rainmaker in 1956 and starred alongside legends like Elvis Presley, and John Wayne. Yet despite his early momentum and undeniable screen presence, Holliman's career plateaued. Those who worked with him described him as likable but limited, a man who never fully grasped the importance of reinvention. Studio memos from the late 1950s reveal Holliman's reluctance to challenge himself. He repeatedly turned down roles that required accent work or emotional complexity, insisting he was better suited for good old American fellas. When approached for a role in Judgment at Nuremberg, he declined, citing it as too political. The part eventually went to William Shatner. His acting choices reflected a pattern of playing it safe. Directors grew frustrated by his resistance to direction. Richard Fleischer, who directed Holliman in The Trap, later remarked that he wasn't difficult, he just didn't stretch. Holliman avoided stage roles, refused to train in dialects, and made few appearances outside the Western or war genre. Off-screen, his business decisions were equally shallow. He invested most of his earnings into a restaurant venture in Burbank, which failed within 3 years due to mismanagement. He declined television opportunities in the early 1960s, believing film roles would always come his way. While Holliman continued working in small parts into the 1980s, his presence dimmed with each passing year. He was never disliked. He was never scandalized, but he also never grew. In a town that rewards risk, Earl Holliman built a career on predictability and watched it quietly fade. Marlene Dietrich's strategic surrender. Marlene Dietrich was many things: sultry, mysterious, commanding. She captivated the world in The Blue Angel and Morocco. Her image was crafted to perfection by director Josef von Sternberg. However, behind the camera, Dietrich constructed a performance far more enduring than any role she played. She cloaked herself in strategic ignorance, feigning simplicity, even stupidity, to maneuver through an industry that wanted her seductive but silent. Studio records from Paramount in the 1930s revealed that Dietrich would often pretend not to understand English during contract disputes, though she was fluent. When asked to comment on politics, she demurred, claiming to know very little about such matters. She allowed male directors to shape her lighting, blocking, and even dialogue delivery, cultivating a persona of passive compliance. In private, she was anything but. Her letters, now preserved in German archives, reveal a razor-sharp mind. However, Dietrich chose not to project that intelligence publicly. She once told a journalist that men are frightened of smart women and prefer a whisper to a sentence. This calculated naivety came at a cost. As the studio system weakened in the 1950s, Dietrich had few options. She hadn't cultivated herself as a producer, director, or writer, unlike contemporaries like Bette Davis or Katharine Hepburn. She had no fallback. She toured as a singer, draped in sequins, performing old standards. But the film world had moved on. Dietrich wasn't unintelligent, but she allowed herself to be underestimated to survive, and in doing so limited her own legacy. She played the long game, but in playing it safe, she forfeited her full potential. What remained was the mask, beautiful, mysterious, and tragically one-dimensional. Tony Curtis's shallow stardom. Tony Curtis rose from a tough New York upbringing to become one of Hollywood's most recognizable leading men. With his matinee idol looks and magnetic screen presence, he starred in classics like Sweet Smell of Success and Some Like It Hot. However, behind the charisma, Curtis was often criticized for his shallowness, both in performance and in life. Directors often noted that Curtis struggled with complex material. Billy Wilder once said he had to extract the performance from him, frame by frame. His early years were defined by superficial roles and vanity projects, and even at the height of his fame, Curtis admitted he had no interest in the inner workings of the film industry. He told a reporter in 1960 that he never read scripts all the way through. He made frequent miscalculations in interviews, once referring to Laurence Olivier as that English guy who yells a lot. Curtis also passed on several serious roles that could have elevated his status, choosing instead projects that emphasized looks over substance. His relationships were equally impulsive. He married 6 times, often after whirlwind romances, and made headlines for petty, erratic behavior. Tony Curtis had raw talent and undeniable charm, but lacked the introspection or discipline to harness it for long-term greatness. Guy Madison's empty success. Guy Madison, born Robert Mosley, was discovered while working as a telephone lineman in California. One glance at his chiseled features, and he was whisked into stardom by agent Henry Wilson. However, Madison's ascent to fame wasn't accompanied by acting skill or professional savvy. He became the poster boy for actors who relied solely on appearance, lacking even the basic instincts for navigating a studio career. Critics were consistently underwhelmed by his performances. Until the End of Time and The Charge at Feather River, Madison's line delivery was described as wooden, his facial expressions blank. Director William Castle remarked that Madison had the personality of a bookshelf, adding that multiple takes were required just to capture passable scenes. Despite this, he became a teen heartthrob during the 1950s. Studio insiders acknowledged he was photogenic and malleable, but admitted he had no ambition beyond showing up and hitting his marks. He was known for asking producers which way to face the camera, even into his 4th film. Madison also made bizarre financial moves, purchasing a ranch in Wyoming with no staff or income plan. It quickly failed. By the 1960s, his career had withered, and he was reduced to dubbed European films and low-budget westerns. Guy Madison had every opportunity, but no idea what to do with them.